Hi everyone, and nice to see some faces again that I remember from last year, and obviously lots of new people too. So those of you who attended Bitesize last year will have heard my introduction to practical ethics, a very similar version of it before, but hopefully it's still good to get one back into the zone of thinking about practical ethics and the upcoming sessions. And for those who haven't attended Bitesize before, which I think is most of you, I hope you will enjoy our Bitesize sessions and this intro, which hopefully will set the scene for the sort of things we'll be talking about. So I hope you can all hear me. Good. Okay, so I'm going to try and share the screen now, and then I'll just double check if that works okay. So, 1 second now. Now, so can people see the screen share at the moment? You see it?
We can see everything, Emma, including the upcoming slides.
Okay, that's perfect. I'll just change it to slideshow now if I can. For the
Perfect.
it's, now, is it at a slideshow view now for people?
It's still in presenter view.
Okay, I know. What I might do is I'll stop the share and just share it again now that it's in the. Sorry, just to have it right for us. Let's see now if this works. Any better?
Perfect. Yeah,
Okay,
great
good.
stuff.
Okay, so today I just want to say a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about practical ethics. And it's near synonym applied ethics too, but we tend to in the Uehiro talk about practical ethics. And what we mean by it and the sorts of issues that practical ethicists are concerned with. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a few examples. So I hope the slides are moving. Let me know if they're not. So suppose you watch the film Babe, and this is a film in which a lovable pig is saved from the butcher's knife. And after watching this film, you're prompted to think, or while watching this film, you're prompted to think about whether and when you are justified in eating meat, for example. Then imagine instead that you see images of starving children from distant countries on the television. And this prompts you to reflect on whether and how much you ought to do by way of help, what you ought to do, if anything, to help these people. Or imagine that you read about a terminally ill person's legal fight to change the law on euthanasia in the UK. And this prompts you to think about whether and when euthanasia should be legalized, questions related to that. So the reason I put forward these examples there now is to draw attention to the fact that when you ask these kinds of questions and think about these kinds of things, you're engaging in practical ethics. You're thinking about specific problems that raise ethical issues and thinking about how we ought to navigate these problems, what we ought to do, trying to make some steps towards a resolution as to how we should go forward when it comes to these sorts of things. So, given that, what do we mean by practical ethics? So, when we do practical ethics, we are applying moral philosophy to concrete or specific problems. So the practical commitment is what characterizes it. So it's a branch or subdivision of the more general moral philosophy, which is one part of philosophy in general. What is moral philosophy? Well, it's the part of philosophy that's concerned with reflecting upon right and wrong, or how we should live our lives in relation to others. So what sort of things are right, what's wrong to do, and given that we're social beings and we live alongside others and we can't do exactly what we want all the time if we're to live harmoniously, what sort of things should we do to live harmoniously with others? So that's moral philosophy in general, and practical ethics is a subdivision of it, where we're looking at particular real world problems that raise ethical issues, often very pressing ethical issues, and trying to use philosophical methods, some moral theory and reasoned argument, which is part of philosophical methods, to get some way closer to figuring out what we ought to do when it comes to these problems. I hope that's all making sense thus far for people. Okay, good. So I said that practical ethics is one subdivision of moral philosophy. Now, the boundaries are not entirely clear-cut or distinct. There's some overlap, but generally, moral philosophy is considered to involve three general subdivisions. One is what's known as meta-ethics, and these are the more abstract questions about morality and about right and wrong. So what we might call the big picture questions. So things like, what is morality in the first place? What do we mean by morality? Is there such a thing as a true moral claim? You know, where do moral claims come from? Are they things that are true, independent of our minds? You know, that there's a true thing that's right to do, regardless of whether we were here or not to decide this, or whether moral claims are something that we construct in our society with our a group of minded individuals construct. Questions like that. Also questions like, why be moral in the first place? Why should we be concerned about morality? Why should we be concerned about doing what the morally good thing to do or the right thing to do? So that's meta-ethics. So as I said, it's the more abstract sort of questions about morality. A second subdivision then is normative ethics. And normative ethics is concerned with trying to construct or figure out general principles or rules about what we ought to do, about what is right to do. So often trying to come up with a particular theory of how we should live our lives in relation to others. So like whether it is the case that we should always try and maximize well-being or the good, or whether it's the case that we should live according to certain rules, perhaps rules that a hypothetical group of reasoners would agree upon, I think are reasonable, or whether there's certain principles that we should live by because we have a duty to live by them, a duty to other beings. So that there's lots of different normative ethical theories, and they're concerned with coming up with the general rules or figuring out, and of course there's a lot of dispute as to that. Whereas practical ethics is different, and it's characterized by the practical commitment, but also the specificity, dealing with specific problems rather than general rules. So trying to reflect on, deliberate, and reach some sort of rational agreement about what we ought to do when it comes to specific problems. So there's many different methods that are used. Sometimes it's practical ethicists will draw on various normative ethical theories when they are reasoning, so draw on plausible moral principles or reasons. They will also sometimes draw on try and reason by appealing to intuition. So sometimes there will be a use of certain methods known as thought experiments, where someone will put forward a hypothetical scenario and try and see what way our intuitions go about what we think is the right thing to do in this scenario, and use that, combining it with theory and argument, reasoned argument. And practical ethics, because it's concerned with real-world problems, there's a hope that the conclusions of practical ethicists' work might inform policy, or at least some sort of insights into what we will actually do when it comes to these problems, either by ethical guidelines or in the law. So practical ethicists often work with other disciplines quite a lot. So working with those who work in law, policymakers more generally, and also then other disciplines, let's say like psychology or neuroscience, or medicine, depending on the ethical issue that we're talking about. Okay, everyone's still with me here too? Okay. Right, so what sort of problems then are practical ethicists concerned with? Well, there's a huge range of problems, so I'm just going to offer a few examples and then talk about some of the things that we'll be discussing over the course of this bite-sized program. So when practical ethics kind of developed as a subdiscipline, it was kind of in the 70s when it developed. Before that, philosophers didn't really focus just on particular problems. There was a lot of focus on more general theory and maybe discussion of particular problems within it, but not a fully developed sort of discipline. And in the 1970s, that kind of changed. Philosophers began to work on trying to figure out what we should do when it comes to these concrete issues. And it probably began with discussions in biomedical ethics, and then maybe spread to business ethics and professional ethics and beyond. So one big area within practical ethics is biomedical ethics, where philosophers, practical ethicists look at ethical questions and issues and concerns that arise in medicine or in the biological sciences. So, for example, there's beginning of life issues. So questions like, well, first of all, let's say, is when or under what circumstances is it morally permissible to have an abortion? Should we pursue stem cell research? Is it morally permissible to have children as we want, or are there other ethical considerations that arise? Is there some moral reasons that speak against having, let's say, children or more children? What other issues that arise in various areas of reproductive technologies, how they should be used, and then certain things that arise when we do use them. So other concerns about what we do with embryos and things like that. So that's one part, that one set of questions that arise when it comes to bioethics. Then there's also end-of-life issues. So like we mentioned at the outset, questions about euthanasia. You know, when, if ever, is assisting someone to end their life morally permissible? And then the further question, when, if ever, under what circumstances should it be legally permitted, which sometimes people might have different thoughts on that. Then how do we deal with questions of children near the end of life? How do we navigate the concerns that arise here when children may not be able to give fully informed consent in the way an adult would, if it was the case that they were reaching the end of life. So there's some other issues, and then we have things like healthcare resource allocation. So this is quite a very common everyday concern of policymakers. How do we, when we have very scarce resources, how do we distribute it? You know, what values do we use to guide this? How do we decide when there are very many pressing concerns, how we spread it for the best outcome, for the fairest outcome, what would be just? So there's lots of questions there that concern policymakers and practical ethicists. Then we have questions about the practice of healthcare. So there has been, you know, a biomedical bioethics revolution in the latter section of the 20th century, where due to the work of ethicists and policymakers, it's now the case that we do have codes of ethics for medicines and healthcare, for medicine and healthcare, which did not exist to the same as well developed in the generations that preceded it. So now it is the case that there are requirements for informed consent to biomedical interventions, and there's rules about what informed consent consists in, what makes it valid. And then other principles like beneficence and non-beneficence in the carrying out of healthcare practices. So questions about this, what is also something that is a concern of practical ethicists. And then public health issues. So when it comes to rather than individual health issues, but let's say things that concern us as a collective, like the infectious disease, vaccination, or various things to do with health and well-being and the promotion of health in society. Questions about what we do, let's say, like when we had the pandemic, what do we do and try to manage such a public health issue, and also how do we inform people what we do, how do we educate people about things that can be beneficial for their health, and in what ways is it good to do it or not. Okay, so that's one sort of set of questions, one broad set of questions that we might be talking about if we're engaging in practical ethics. There's also separately a load of questions about our duties and our treatment of non-human animals. So questions about the scientific experimentation involving animals. When, if ever, is this permissible? Under what circumstances? When would it be justifiable? Questions then about our farming practices. What sort of farming is permissible? What sort of conditions and what sort of lives is it permissible for us to inflict on animals that we may or may not use for food purposes? Is it permissible to farm animals for food purposes? If so, what sort of farming practices can we ethically pursue? Then questions about pet ownership, our responsibilities to our pets, our duties to our pets, the permissibility of owning pets, and then questions maybe related to veterinary medicine, which relates to the last topic of biomedicine, the practice of veterinary medicine and the principles that vets and values that vets should work with as well. And then wild animal ethics, so ethical issues that arise in how we conduct ourselves and how we treat and relate to wild animals. So let's say here we're often talking about habitat destruction, rescue of wild animals if they are injured, whether we should, under what circumstances, and what duties we have to preserve animals' habitats and various environments as well. Okay, I hope you're all still with me. So, so there are two broad areas in which we might explore topics, and there's a host or a whole range of other issues that concern all of us as practical ethicists. So some examples, so issues pertaining to the climate change. Here you might have questions about what should we do with respect to the climate, and what ought an individual to do? Is it the case that the individual is still obliged to do something to try and mitigate climate change, even if their individual contribution will make no difference? Do they still have some sort of duty to make some contribution? Who ought to do what? What sort of things do we need to do? Do we have duties to future generations? And what is the moral status of the environment and the non-human inhabitants of it? What sort of duties do we have to preserve, conservation duties, etc.? Then questions about global poverty. So again, like the scenario I mentioned, where we might see people on the television who are suffering absolute poverty and extreme hunger. What are our duties here? Do we have duties? Is it a matter of charity and something that would be just nice for us to do to try and help? Or do we actually have some sort of moral obligation such that we are wronging people if we don't do something when we can? Is the burden on us all as individuals, or is it primarily a burden to be placed on governments? Questions like that. And also issues relating to war. So I know later we'll be talking about that in a minute, that there will be one of the classes talking about the ethics of war. So can there ever be a just war, for example? Is it ever just to go to war for some particular reason or cause? And then the justice of continuing a war, just conduct then within war. So what sort of conduct is permissible when you are in war, which is a separate question for whether it's just to go into war in the first place. And then the permissibility of continuing a war at a certain point. Is at a certain point a war that was just no longer just to continue. And also then questions about, let's say, the harming of civilians in war. Is that ever permissible as a side effect of some other action if the action or the aim is considered just? Or questions about whether there's different status of soldiers in war. So let's say if some combatants are fighting on a side that is unjust, are there different duties? Has one different duties with respect to them than if the people fighting are fighting for a just cause, if there is a just cause for war? Questions like that. Questions about the permissibility of punishment, so punishing those who offend. What justifies our punishing people, if anything, and what sorts of punishments are permissible for people, and what are the goals of punishment, and do any of them justify practices that we currently pursue? And a growing area within the discipline is digital ethics. So there's very many emerging technologies that are coming about that present new challenges. Some of them old challenges just in a new way, coming at us in a new way, but some of them new. So when we're talking about the pervasiveness of smartphones and various media and easy access to the internet and all the distractions that come with that. So there are very many things that distract us in a way that more than we ever had before, because there's very many techniques that are used by the designers of various online platforms to attract our attention. And questions about what we should do about this, what individual responsibilities we have, let's say, to not necessarily always succumb to these distractions if there's things that we actually want to focus on instead. But then also the responsibilities of designers and the responsibilities of governments with respect to these things, given that there's, and also in the face of some evidence that we may be having our capacities to attend things may be declining, but also maybe some of our social relationships might be somewhat affected by our constant state of distraction. And then other questions then relating to the ethics of AI. So the moral status of, let's say, AI entities, and also concerns about privacy in the face of so much data about ourselves now being accessible in various ways. So I hope these give us just a taste of the breadth of the subject of practical ethics and the various things that we might delve into as we explore it. So I just want to say a little bit about what is upcoming in over the next number of weeks. So today is just the intro, or just to set the scene. And next week, Anders is going to talk about the ethics of deepfakes. So by deepfakes, we mean when generative AI and computer graphics can be used to depict images or videos or things that did not actually happen, situations that did not actually happen. And the concerns that might arise, given that we can do this, and whether such techniques might sometimes be a good thing or be used in a good way. So questions about that. So that's next week, I believe. I hope I'm right with the order, Liz. Then the following week, Anna is talking about the ethics of mental health and illness. So discussing how we define mental health, how we define mental illness and how we distinguish it or otherwise from mental health. And whether we can do this, whether this has to rely on some sort of social conventions or social norms, whether we can define it without invoking some sort of societal norms. And then the impact, discussing maybe the impact and the concerns that a mental health diagnosis might have on an individual. So discussing the concept of mental health, how we understand it in illness, and maybe the consequences of these understandings. The following week then, Christina is talking about the ethics of grief bots. Grief bots are digital personas that mimic a person who is deceased, so a previously living person. So this idea has gained ground, this idea of a digital persona to mimic a person who someone has lost. And of course, there's many things that might raise, many concerns that might raise as to whether grief bots are a good thing for us to use or not. So Christina will be discussing grief and some possible benefits of going through a grieving process, and then trying to discuss maybe what sort of design criteria we should have if we were to make use of grief bots. Then Neil, after that, is going to talk about our decision making. So we tend to have in Western liberal societies an idea of ourselves as rational, autonomous, independent agents who make our decisions for ourselves and have a right to make decisions for ourselves. But the empirical evidence and the ideas about how we come to be decision makers indicate that we are very much dependent on others, that we decide through dialogue with others, and that our capacities to decide things develop by our being social beings living with others. So Neil is going to talk about how, given that we're decide in this in an invariably social context, how we can resist illegitimate influence over our decisions while still making good decisions in dialogue with others. Then Jeff, after that, is going to talk about the ethics of war, particularly in the current context of the Ukraine and Gaza. So he'll be talking about some of the things we already mentioned, things like whether there can be a just war, what counts as a just reason for going to war or justice in war, and then whether combatants are morally equal in terms of how what we can permissibly do to them, and then the questions about civilians and civilian harming in war contexts. Then Becky is going to talk about the question of caesarean sections and women's choice with respect to whether they undergo a caesarean section. So discussing the idea that women's choice or preference for undergoing a caesarean section to deliver their child via caesarean section should be respected, even in cases where doctors think a caesarean is medically unnecessary. So Becky will just be raising the case for the claim that the woman's preference in this context should be still respected. Then Hazem is going to talk about government economic policy. So we know that when governments make decisions about how they distribute resources and wealth and what way the policy is going to work, that it has impact on economic figures. But Hazem is going to highlight how these economic choices make a difference to the distribution of life, death, and well-being in a society, and discuss in what routes could policymakers and governments be more transparent about the values that they are drawing upon or are embodying in their decision making. Then Gary is going to talk about the ethics of creating people. So many of us might at first glance think that creating people is something that's morally neutral, but there are some arguments against doing so, some moral reasons why we might think that we should not create more people, some arguments in favor of creating more people because of the well-being that we might give to those people, and then some arguments that are somewhere in between as to, but all of which suggest that creating people isn't necessarily morally neutral. Gary's going to be discussing those sort of arguments. And then I come back in the last week and I'm going to talk about the idea that we have a right to be respected as social beings. So it connects a little bit with Neil's ideas or talk. So I mentioned earlier that in Western liberal societies, we think that we are rational and autonomous beings and have kind of a right to be respected as such, so that it's at least presumptively wrong if people manipulate us or treat us as children or try and make our decisions for us. And in the last week, I want to explore the idea that we have a parallel right to be respected as a social being, or at least that the reasons that we might advance for thinking that we have a right to be respected as a rational being or seem to also support the idea that we have a right to be, or similar reasons support the idea that we have a right to be respected as a social being. And I want then to examine the implications of the idea that we have a right to be respected as social beings in the context of criminal justice, specifically for a treatment of those who offend. So I hope that all makes sense and gives a sort of outline of the things we might be talking about over the next while.